What's going on, everybody? VitalSyntax here, and I wanted to make a video talking about 120 frames per second versus 60 frames per second, or hertz. It doesn't really matter. And the reason I want to make this video is recently Woody's Gamertag, who's somebody that I follow on YouTube personally, did a really good in-depth video talking about his experience with everything from low-end CRT televisions to flat screens, plasma TVs, different types of computer monitors, ones with different types of input lag, ones with different types of refresh rates, different resolutions, everything. I mean, there's so many different aspects and different specifications that define a computer monitor or a TV. You've got your resolution, which is usually 720p or 1280 by 720, 1920 by 1080 for 1080p, or HD plus resolutions like 2650 by 1600 or 2650 by 1440. Then there's also the refresh rate, and there's also the input lag, and there's also the response time. There's the inch measurement, corner to corner. Is it a 24-inch screen? Is it a 55-inch TV? And he did a really good job of summarizing everything. He basically went over all the different aspects except for resolution, which I think resolution isn't really something that people don't understand. I think it's pretty basic. So I think he went over the important topics that a lot of people are confused about. And he personally said that he couldn't tell a huge difference. He said that there was a very slight difference between 60 hertz and 120 hertz. And also recently, Linus Tech Tips, or I guess it's the NCIX channel, which is a PC hardware retailer in Canada, similar to Newegg, which is where I usually buy my PC hardware from. They have a YouTube channel as well. One of the guys on there, his name is Linus, who also has his own YouTube channel called Linus Tech Tips. They also recently did, I think like the day before Woody's Gamertag did his video, a video about 120 hertz versus 60 hertz. Actually, more importantly, I should say 120 frames per second versus 60 frames per second, because even if you have a 120 hertz monitor, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're playing at 120 frames per second. So I just want to make that distinction. And in their test, they couldn't really tell a difference either. They had just a casual gamer, a guy who had never played Battlefield 3 before, a guy who I'm guessing probably wasn't even a PC gamer. He'd never used a 120 hertz monitor before, and they tested it in a blind test to see if he could guess whether or not it was a 60 hertz or a 120 hertz monitor, and he only got 1 out of 5 guesses correctly. So essentially that tells you that he could not tell the difference between the two. And I wanted to kind of and there could have been some issues in that experiment. Maybe they weren't actually running at 120 frames per second when they switched it to 120 hertz. Maybe they needed to turn the graphic settings down or something like that so they can actually see it. And they're going to do a follow-up video hopefully pretty soon. But anyway, I want to talk about my personal experience with 120 hertz. Or sorry, I should keep saying 120 frames per second. Because I recently got a new monitor. It's the BenQ XL2420T, which isn't necessarily the best gaming monitor. I would argue, personally, I think the Yamakasi Cat Leap is the best gaming monitor. It is a 2650 by 1440 resolution monitor. It can be overclocked on certain models to 120 frames per second. Even people have gotten up to 144 frames per second, or sorry, hertz. Hertz is the measurement of a monitor on how many images it can display per second. FPS is the amount of images your graphics card can output. So I just want to make that distinction. And I'm not going to go into all the details, technical details. If you want to learn more about monitors, then you should definitely go check out Woody's Gamertag's video, because he did a really good job of explaining those basics. And I recently got this new monitor, and I was switching from a 60 hertz monitor, right? And there was a huge difference. I could tell instantly that I was using a much smoother monitor. It's like when I first got my gaming PC, I think 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. I think it's probably a year and a half ago, maybe even less, I'm not sure. I haven't had it for that long. And I was upgrading for my PS3, and at the time I was playing a lot of Battlefield Bad Company 2. And I went from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second because, the game's capped at 30 on consoles. And there was a huge difference. I mean, instantly when I started playing on the computer, it looked so much more smooth. It looked so much more crisp. It looks so much more fluid and responsive. And that also has to do with the input lag and the response time of the pixels and everything of the monitor as well, which were a lot better than the TV I was using. But regardless, the actual frames per second made a huge difference. And then when I went back and started playing on the PS3 again, because I had some friends that were still on the PS3, it looked really choppy. It looked really weird, which is something that I had never noticed when I was just, I was used to the 30 frames per second. And I would say after about 2 hours, for me personally, it's probably different for everybody. For me personally, after about 2 hours, my eyes get used to whatever frame rate I'm using. So for example, when I use my PS3, or when I used to use my PS3, I don't have it anymore. When I used to use my PS3 on a 30 frame per second game like Battlefield Bad Company 2 for 2 hours, my eyes get used to it. Now I noticed that it looked a little blurrier. It didn't look as crisp, but my eyes weren't irritated by it. It wasn't like giving me a headache or giving me sore eyes. But when I switched from a high frame per second, like 120 frames per second, to 60 or 60 to 30, the initial like 2 hour time that my eyes are getting adjusted, I do get somewhat of a headache, but it's more of like an eye ache. It's kind of like sore eyes, like it's like you need glasses or something, or and you're like trying to squint your eyes to see stuff clearly. And that also has to do with the resolution, keep in mind, because when you're playing on a console like the PS3, it's probably sub 720p resolution that's being upscaled to whatever your TV is. Whereas on the PC side of things, you can actually output a true 1080p signal, or even an HD plus signal if you have a Kazi Cat Leap, or one of the Dell monitors, or any monitor that has a HD plus resolution. And that also is going to make it more crisp and things like that. So ultimately, what I just wanted to go over is, for me personally, there's a huge difference. The difference between 60 and 120 frames per second is just as big as the difference between 30 and 60. Now, keep in mind that 30 frames to 60 frames per second, the difference is doubling, but the difference is, at the same time, only adding 30 frames per second. But when you go from 60 to 120, you're also doubling, but this time you're adding 60 frames per second instead of 30. So you're adding more frames per second. But also keep in mind that as you get higher and higher, like say we're going from 120 to 240, yeah, we're doubling, we're adding 120 frames per second instead of 60 or 30. The higher and higher you get, the less noticeable it is, so the more you have to add to it. I know it's confusing, but it should make sense if you maybe re-listen to what I said. So for me, the difference between 120 frames per second and 60 frames per second is just as big as the difference between 30 frames and 60 frames per second. Now, is it necessarily worth it? Yeah, you have to keep in mind that a 120 hertz monitor has its downsides. Typically, they have really good input lag, as in low input lag. Typically, they have really good response time, especially the BenQ XL2420T. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so highly rated, is because it's just so good for gaming, for input lag, refresh rate, and response time. There are downsides. The biggest downside, I think, is the color reproduction. There's different types of panels. You got TN panels and IPS panels. Those are the two main ones. There's lots of other ones. But the two main ones are TN panels and IPS panels. IPS panels do a lot better job at reproducing colors, but TN panels are a lot more responsive, have less input lag, and are the only monitors that can really go up to 120 frames per second, at least that are on the market, that are there are some IPS panels out there that I believe that the Cat Leap is actually an IPS panel, but I could be wrong. But anyway, typically the TN panels, you're going to get a better response time, a better refresh rate, a better input lag, but it's going to be worse color reproduction. And the other big thing is you're going to have worse viewing angles. So viewing angle is where the colors start to get washed out, or where the brightnesses and contrast and stuff start to lose the effect when you're moving your head up. Or you're moving your head to the left or the right. If you're looking at your monitor from an angle instead of straight on, then it'll be messed up. And I have to say that I have two TN panels, and I also have one IPS panel that I'm not currently using. At least on this desktop, I'm using it on a different computer. It's very big. The viewing angle is pretty annoying if you're not sitting at a desk. If you're sitting at a desk, you're stationary. You're not like moving around. So I personally don't think the viewing angle really matters too much. But if you're, it's kind of like a mobile setting, especially like on a phone or a tablet or a laptop where you're moving around, you're having to position in different areas, IPS panels are, I think, the way to go, because you get really, really good viewing angles. As far as the color reproduction goes, I'm not, I don't know. There is a huge difference, and I can see the difference visually. And if you're a designer, like a photographer or a web designer or something like that, or a graphic artist or something like that, then that's probably pretty important to you. But for me, I'm not necessarily considered a professional web designer. I do web design kind of on my free time as kind of somewhat of a hobby, and I do get paid for it. I do graphic design in the same type of sense, and I'm also in school for 3D animation and game design. So color reproduction is important to me, but I don't think that I would personally rather have the higher refresh rate, lower response time, and higher or better response time and input lag that a TN panel can offer. So it's just kind of a personal preference. If you're a gamer, I think that you should go for a TN panel. If you're one of those other like artists or something, then an IPS panel. Now, as far as like an advantage you're gonna get, some people will expect that when they go out and buy like a headset, or when they go out and buy a new graphics card and get better frames, that they're instantly gonna just like improve their kill death ratio or be a better player instantly. And that's not the case ever. The case is that it allows you to become a better player over time. So say, for example, when I first got my headset, before I was using just like speakers on my TV or whatever, it took me a couple weeks, maybe a month or so, to start being able to hear footsteps, start being able to hear surroundings, hear people reloading, hear people shooting in the distance, and trying to locate their position. It wasn't just an instant thing that you gain. It kind of gives you the ability to become a sound whore in a sense. And Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the gameplay you're watching right now, is a great example of that, because this game has a lot to do with footsteps. If you hold shift, you can walk or crouch, and you can be silent, and it plays a huge role in the gameplay. And it's the same way as for a monitor. When you first get a monitor that's 120 frames per or hertz, first of all, you have to have the hardware, as in the graphics card and the memory, and sometimes even like the hard drive on open world games, and your processor if it's a CPU bottlenecked game, to be able to push that frame rate. So for example, when I got my 120 hertz monitor, I was running off of one GTX 570, and I was only able to output Battlefield on like medium settings to like 80 or 90 frames per second. And that wasn't using the full potential of my monitor, which I just spent like $400 on, which you have to keep in mind. You're going to end up spending at least $150 more, probably more around $200 to $250 more for a 120 hertz monitor compared to a 60 hertz TN panel. IPS panels are also more expensive than just your low-end introductory TN panels that have, whatever. When I first got it, I had that one GTX 570. I went out and actually bought a second one. I got it used for really cheap, like $100, which is like a $350 graphics card. And I just had to do some repairs. There was a broken fan, and I had to buy a $7 fan replacement. And it works totally fine. It works really cool. I'm using an SLI now, and that resulted in me having to buy a new motherboard, because I didn't pay attention when I was buying my motherboard that it didn't support SLI at the time. So I had to buy a new motherboard, which I got for like $12 off eBay, and it's a $150 motherboard. And all I had to do was replace 2 pins on it, and it works totally awesome. So I would suggest, if you're somebody out there that's kind of on a budget, or just looking to save money so you can get better hardware in general, check out eBay, because damn, I have gotten some really good deals in products that were partially broken, and people think that means that they're completely broken, and all I had to do was buy like a $2 replacement or a $7 replacement item and fix it. But anyway, I'm not gonna talk about that in this video. And nice headshot right there. And another nice shot. I'm impressing myself. So I bought the second GTX 570, and then I was actually able to output 120 frames per second or even more in Battlefield 3 and other games, of course, because Battlefield 3 is kind of a more demanding game than games like CS:GO or something like that. So keep in mind that if you do want to go for 120 hertz, you have to have the hardware to actually push it to take full potential. If you're only outputting 60 frames per second to a 120 hertz monitor, you're not going to see any difference in frame rate that you would from a 60 hertz monitor. There might be differences in input lag, and there might be differences in response time and stuff like that, of the actual pixels changing color, which is response time, and input lag is different. Once again, I'm not going to get into the specific details. Check out Woody's video if you want to see all those details. But really what it comes down to is whether or not it's worth it, is how much money you have, how rich you are. Because, if you're a millionaire, spending $200 extra on something like that is nothing. And if you're a college student like me, or somebody that's barely making a buy month to month, then you should really not be going out and spending extra money on something like that. So is it worth it? I think for me personally, yes, because I'm a huge gamer. I play first-person shooters. If you're playing other types of games like strategy games or like Facebook games or something, or like RPG games, I don't think it's worth it, because you don't really need that twitch reflex that you need in a first-person shooter. If you're a first-person shooter player and you play it almost religiously, or not religiously but very intensely, then yeah, I think that it's worth the extra money. Depending on your financial situation, of course. I mean, if you can't afford it, then you can't afford it. But I think that it's really what you should be skimping on is your CPU. A lot of people will go out and buy like, if you're just a gamer, keep in mind, a lot of people will go out and spend like $1,000 on like an extreme CPU, and you don't really need a really powerful CPU for most modern games. It's not going to be bottlenecking your system. What you need is a really good graphics card. Oh. A really good mouse, I believe, and a really good monitor. I think those are the three most key ingredients for a good first-person shooter. Is a mouse that tracks properly, and that's really good. I would suggest the Death Adder. That's kind of a really good price-wise mouse that's really accurate. You need a really good graphics card or set of graphics card. If you're doing SLI, you need a really good monitor. I think those are the three kind of key things. But anyway, those are just my opinions. I know it was kind of a long-winded video. It was also some long gameplay, so I thought I would just talk over some topics I could blab on about. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give me a like or favorite, and leave me your opinions down below on what you think about 120 hertz monitor, because there's half of the people say it doesn't matter, half the people say it definitely matters, and I'm on the side that says it definitely matters. But anyway, I'll see you guys later. Bye.